April 14, 1912. In the 40th minute of the 23rd hour, somewhere in the North Atlantic Ocean, the RMS Titanic is unwelcomely kissed on the cheek by a rather stubborn iceberg. You know what happens next. But you might not know that one of the passengers, the ship's chief baker, defied death that night. This heroic man refused to get on one of the lifeboats, instead making sure women and children were saved. When the ship finally plunged into the water, he wrote it down in his own words as if it was an elevator. But what we liked about this man is the fact that when he knew the end was nigh, he decided to get hammered. He went into the pantry and chugged down some liquor. Why not end on a high, he must have thought. He very likely was the last person alive on that ship just before it was completely submerged. The last who survived, that is. So his story is important. But what's more, he spent 2 hours in that freezing cold water in his drunken state. While others died in minutes, he tread water and didn't even feel very cold. It's nothing short of a miracle that this happened. You'll hear more about him later and the reasons he survived when he really should have died. But since he was the last guy on the ship, we'll leave his story to last. When you read about the number of people that were on the ship that fateful night, not all the sources sound the same. We can't be sure what exactly the numbers were, but you'll generally hear about 2,200, 900 of whom were working on the ship. Some of the passengers were insanely wealthy, others were depressingly poor. First-class tickets on the Titanic went up to £870. Third-class tickets cost as little as £7. If we were thinking in US dollars, we're talking over $130,000 in today's money for the best first-class ticket and over $1,000 in today's money for a third-class ticket. A second class would have set you back about $1,834 in today's money. So the experience on that ship was very different for many people. Some of the deaths became front-page news. If there were social media platforms back then, these deaths would have resulted in a lot of strangers writing RIP on their Facebook pages. But some of the poorest people on the Titanic didn't even get a marked gravestone. Some survivors never really recovered from the ordeal. One of them was Frederick Fleet. He was one of the crewmen on the ship and the one that shouted iceberg when things were looking a bit hairy. He later testified in court saying things might have been different if he had some binoculars. In his own words, he said, "We could have all seen it a bit sooner." When someone asked him just how much sooner, he replied, "Well, enough to get out of the way." When he saw the iceberg from the nest at 11:39 p.m., he rang the bell to notify the others. He also used the nest phone to tell the bridge that there was possible trouble ahead. The call was answered by 6th Officer James Paul Moody, who asked Fleet exactly what he'd seen. Fleet replied, "Iceberg, right ahead." During his testimony, he was asked how large the iceberg was, and he said he didn't really know. But then, when asked if it was about as large as one of the tables in the courtroom, he replied, "It would be as large as those two tables put together when I saw it first." Fleet was ordered to help put people on lifeboats. He got in Lifeboat 6 himself along with 28 other people, 4 of whom were other men. Lifeboat 6 could have held 65 people. Fleet was one of the men that managed the oars on that lifeboat. The guy on the tiller of the boat was Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, a man whose name went down in history. That's because of the way he allegedly treated other occupants of the boat. Some of them later said he refused to pick up people in the water, calling some of the people stiffs. Then there's the famous story of the millionaire named Molly Brown, who got so peeved with him that she threatened to throw him in the water. She became angry when Hitchens told her that if they went back, they would likely be swamped and go down themselves. She wrote about her experience in the Newport Herald newspaper, saying, "The only seaman in our boat was the quartermaster. He was put at the rudder and standing much higher than we were. He was shivering like an aspen. As we pulled away from the boat, we heard sounds of firing and were told later it was officers shooting as they were letting down the boats from the steamer, trying to prevent those from the lower decks from jumping onto the lifeboats." She was wrong about him being the only able seaman. As you know, Fleet was also an able seaman. Fleet, by the way, became very depressed after the accident, and his life later ended bleakly. As for Molly Brown, it said another reason why she threatened Hitchens is that she told him that the women on the boat should row to keep warm. Hitchens didn't like this idea at all. Rowing was a man's job. It's hard to know exactly what happened that night. As the Aspen Democrat-Times said in its April 19, 1912 edition, some of the stories sounded quite hysterical. Some stories were sensational. Brown wrote some more about her time on the lifeboat, and we think her words are quite moving. She said, "The splash of the oars partly drowned the voices of the perishing men on the doomed steamer. The ladies all seemed terrified. Those having husbands, sons, or fathers buried their heads on the shoulders of those near them and moaned and groaned only, while my eyes were glued on the fast-disappearing ship. I partially watched the broad promenade deck. Brown was one of the lucky ones. 39% of the first-class passengers died, mostly men. 76% of the third-class passengers died, and 58% of the second-class passengers died. It wouldn't be fair not to let Hitchens have his say too. We found his testimony. In it, he explained why he wanted to get as far away as possible from the sinking Titanic. He said, Everybody seemed in a very bad condition in the boat, sir. Everybody was quite upset, and I told them that somebody would have to pull. There was no use stopping there alongside the ship, and the ship gradually going by the head. We were in a dangerous place. He also said that he told everyone to row, women too. As for some of the misunderstandings, he said, the wind had sprung up a bit then, and it got very choppy. I relieved one of the young ladies with the oar and told her to take the tiller. She immediately let the boat come athwart, and the ladies in the boat got very nervous, so I took the tiller back again and told them to manage the best they could. He talked about arguing with a woman, saying she was rather vexed with me in the boat, and I spoke rather straight to her, and she accused me of wrapping myself up in blankets in the boat, using bad language, and drinking all the whiskey, which I deny, sir. He said no one on the boat told him to go back toward the sinking Titanic once they were away, but he admitted that at first he told everyone they needed to get away because if not, the suction created by the sinking ship would pull them under the water. When a senator at the hearing asked him if he said the words, "We are to look out for ourselves now and pay no attention to those stiffs," Hitchens issued a denial. "I never made use of that word, never since I've been born, because I use other words in preference to that," he said. We may never know the truth about the drama on that boat or if there was much drama at all. As Brown said, there was an eerie atmosphere when the Titanic's lights went out. In his testimony, Hitchens said, "We did hear the cries of distress, or I imagine so, sir, for 2 to 3 minutes. Some of the men in the boat said it was the cries of one boat hailing the other. I suppose the reason they said this was not to alarm the women, the ladies in the boat." We should say here that the woman who accused Hitchens of drinking all the whiskey and taking all the blankets was not Molly Brown but another first-class passenger, Leila Meyer. She was taking the trip with her husband, Edgar. The wealthy couple paid £82 for their ticket, which you'll remember would be quite a few $1,000 today. Mrs. Meyer's story is a sad one indeed. Just before she made the trip, her father had died, and when the ship went down, her husband went down with it. She later explained what happened in a rather sad statement. She said, "I tried and tried to get Edgar to come into the lifeboat with me and pleaded to be allowed to stay behind and wait until he could leave, he not caring to leave before all the women had been saved. Mr. Meyer finally persuaded me to leave, reminding me of our 1-year-old child at home. I entered the lifeboat and watched until the Titanic sank, but only for a short time did I see my husband standing beside the rail and assisting other women into boats." Let's now move on to another controversial survival story of the Titanic, this one about the only Japanese passenger on the ship, Masabumi Hosono. Fluent in Russian, he'd been working in Russia on behalf of the Japanese Ministry of Transport. On his way home, he was first to stop in London, and that's when he ended up on the Titanic. When the ship hit the iceberg, Hosono got up to see what was happening. Like most people, he had no idea what happened, so he went up to the boat deck. As the story goes, he was told by a steward to get away from the boat deck. The steward looked at Hosono's Asian appearance and wrongly believed him to be a third-class passenger, folks not allowed on the boat deck. He was actually staying in second class. Things then got worse on the ship. Hosono knew it was definitely going to sink. He later said, "Somehow, I could in no way dispel the feeling of utter dread and desolation." He managed to sneak onto the boat deck all the time, worrying that he might not see his wife and kids again. He helped women and children get into Lifeboat 13, but he saw that there were 2 spaces left when it was lowered. One guy jumped into one space, and Hosono jumped into the other. In terms of protocol back then, this was against the rules, but Hosono wasn't familiar with Western sailing protocols, and he really missed his family. Someone later wrote about his dire situation, saying, "Faced with this textbook moral dilemma, Hosono chose life and lived to regret it." When he was finally aboard the RMS Carpathia rescue ship, he started writing a letter to his wife. This is now a famous document, the only surviving letter from the ship to be written using official Titanic-headed stationery. Since he wrote it when things were so fresh in his mind, it's also interesting to look at today, for it gives a rare glimpse into how things transpired that night. Part of it went, "After the ship sank, there came back again frightful shrills and cries of those drowning in the water. Our lifeboat too was filled with sobbing, weeping children and women worried about the safety of their husbands and fathers. And I too was as much depressed and miserable as they were, not knowing what would become of myself in the long run." Earlier in the letter, he stated that he was indeed ordered to get away from the boat deck and join the third-class passengers. As you know, he wasn't prepared to do this. He wrote, "What a terrible feeling I had. I was alone and screamed." This all sounds very reasonable for a person about to sink into the icy depths of the ocean and never see the smiles on his children's face again, but his story became a huge embarrassment for the Japanese public and the government. For them, the only Japanese guy on the ship had shown utter cowardice. He had shamed the nation, a nation obsessed with honor and dying honorably. The newspapers over there talked about how he'd sneaked onto one of the lifeboats and so let Japan down by not dying as a man should. They talked about how women and children on the Titanic had died while he had sneaked off. The US media joined in, writing stories about brave Western men who'd sacrificed their lives in comparison to Hosono sacrificing nothing. When they referred to him in their stories, they often called him the Japanese stowaway. Because he had chosen not to die an honorable death, Japan made him the subject of something called murahachibu, the Japanese term that means you should be socially ostracized. People wrote him hate mail every day. They said he should have died. They said he should die now. He couldn't walk down the street without people saying bad things about him. He was an outcast. He lived in shame until his death in 1939, but even after that, Japanese media used him as an example, describing him as a man without honor. You can also be sure that his story became a focal point when racist people wanted to talk about Asian people. Well, at least he got to see his wife and kids again. His story isn't much different from that of the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay. The British shipping company was the owner of the Titanic, and when it sank, Ismay was the highest-ranking White Star Line official to survive. Many people called him a coward too, saying the honorable thing to do would have been to go down with the ship. A poem was written about him at the time, which read in part, "The captain stood where the captain should, when a captain's ship goes down. But the owner led when the woman fled, for an owner must not drown." But like Hosono, Ismay did at least help women and children get into lifeboats before he took a place for himself. Also, like Hosono, he lived in shame for the rest of his life. He became terribly depressed and hid from the world, his granddaughter saying he was like a living corpse. He had to testify, of course, which is something we are interested in for this show today. Like everyone else, he heard a bump in the night, but unlike most people, he had to find out what had happened as a matter of urgency. He said he loaded boats with women and children, what he called the natural order of things. When asked why he had gotten on one of the boats, he replied, "The boat was there. There was a certain number of men in the boat, and the officer called out asking if there were any more women, and there was no response. There was no passengers left on the deck." He said he helped to row the lifeboat away, always with his back to the ship. When asked why, he replied, "I did not wish to see her go down." Okay, so it's about time we heard from some third-class survivors of the Titanic. One of them was Rhoda Abbott. She was born in England and later moved to Providence in the US, and that's where she met her future husband, the middleweight champion boxer Stanton Abbott. She divorced him after having 2 kids with him and then took them back to England with her, but the boys never seemed settled in the UK, so she decided to take them back to the US. This is why she was on the Titanic. She was 39 and her 2 boys were 16 and 13. The cabin for all 3 of them cost £20, quite a lot for a third-class cabin, but then there were 3 of them. When the Titanic was pretty much finished, it looked like all 3 of them were going to die. Remember that she was seen as a woman and her boys as grown up. She could have found a lifeboat easier than they could have. Naturally, she wanted to stay with her children. Mrs. Abbott then told the boys that they had one last chance, and they all launched themselves into Collapsible A. It was soon swamped with the weight and started to go down itself. It was fortunate that 5th Officer Harold Lowe picked them up on Collapsible D. She was indeed lucky to survive. Even when she got onto the rescue ship, her legs were badly injured from the cold. After getting off, she couldn't move and spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital. We know a little bit about how things went down because of another third-class survivor who later wrote about Abbott and her kids. She told me that she would get in the lifeboat if there hadn't been so many people around, so she and her sons kept together. She was thankful that 3 of them had stayed with her on that piece of wreckage. The youngest went first, then the other son went. She grew numb and cold and couldn't remember when she got on the Carpathia. There was a piece of cork in her hair, and I managed to get a comb, and it took a long time, but we finally got it out. 537 of the 709 third-class passengers perished, most of whom were men. Nonetheless, some of those who died were women and some were mere girls. For instance, the 10-year-old Catharina van Impe from Belgium died with her father Jean and her mother Rosalie. Of the 53 kids that died on the Titanic, 52 were from third class. Now let's clear something up here. In another show we did about the Titanic disaster, we mentioned the third-class passengers being told to stay in place. We know for a fact that parts of the ship were not accessible to certain passengers, but we also know for a fact that some of the third-class passengers were told to stay in steerage, another name for the place where the third-class passengers stayed. It's complicated, so let's hear what the third-class survivors had to say. In his testimony, third-class passenger Daniel Buckley was asked, "Were you permitted to go up to the top deck without any interference?" He said yes, but then added, "They tried to keep us down at first on our steerage deck. They did not want us to go up to the first-class place at all." He later explained what happened when one guy tried to get out, saying, "There was one steerage passenger there and he was getting up the steps, and just as he was going in a little gate, a fellow came along and chucked him down, threw him down into the steerage place. This fellow got excited and he ran after him, and he could not find him. He got up over the little gate. He did not find him." Another controversial aspect of the disaster is the question of whether there were grills or grates separating the classes. In his testimony, Buckley said there was. He was asked, "There was a gate between the steerage and the first-class deck?" He replied, yes, the first-class deck was higher up than the steerage deck, and there were some steps leading up to it, 9 or 10 steps, and a gate just at the top of the steps. He was then asked if it was locked, to which he replied, it was not locked at the time we made the attempt to get up there, but the sailor or whoever he was locked it, so that this fellow that went up after him broke the lock on it, and he went after that fellow that threw him down. He said that if he could get hold of him, he would throw him into the ocean. He also said that when the gate was broken, he and his third-class passengers had about the same chance of getting a lifeboat. They could not keep them down, he said, which suggests that they were in fact kept down at some point. They weren't locked in like the movie, but they were told to stay in their place. Another third-class survivor said the gates weren't locked, but the stewards kept him and others down. He said the stewards prevented these men from getting up when the order was passed around for the women and children. It seems pretty obvious, seeing that the men had to stay back while working-class women and children were ushered to lifeboats, and given the number of survivors from each class, it's also obvious that third-class men were kept back for as long as possible. As such was the case with American blacksmith Anthony Abbing. He was on his way back to Cincinnati when he only got as far as the Atlantic Ocean. No one really knows how he died, but it's assumed he was locked down in steerage. Some third-class men survived, such as a Norwegian laborer who was heading to the U.S. to do some tough work in South Dakota. His name was Olas Jorgensen Abelseth. He was in a party of 5 on the Titanic, which included a young woman who survived. He later said he and his friends were told to wait on the poop deck, but when the time was around 1:30 and the Titanic was well and truly fudged, they made their way to the boat deck. He said that he saw the last lifeboats leave. That's when sailors were told they could try to get one of the collapsible lifeboats. These were still lifeboats, but they had collapsible canvas sides. Abelseth recounted, I was standing there and I asked my brother-in-law if he could swim, and he said no. I asked my cousin if he could swim, and he said no. So we could see the water coming up. The bow of the ship was going down, and there was a kind of explosion. We could hear the popping and the cracking, and the deck raised up and got so steep that people could not stand on their feet on the deck, so they fell down and slid on the deck into the water right on the ship. When the water was just 5 feet away, they jumped in. Abelseth suddenly found himself entangled in something but managed to get free. The other guys in his party were gone. Abelseth later said he swam for about 20 minutes in the freezing water. There were dead bodies everywhere, but then he saw collapsible A and tried to get on it, only for someone to tell him to get off as he was going to sink the boat. Still, no one tried to push him off and no one tried to help him on. Their fears were rational, since when Abelseth did manage to drag himself over the side, the boat was full of water. He remained submerged in it until they were later picked up. One man froze to death with his arms around Abelseth. He later said, we did not talk very much, except that we would say 1, 2, 3 and scream together for help. As dawn broke and a ship was in the distance, Abelseth grabbed a guy from New Jersey whose face he remembered. The guy just said, who are you? Let me be. Abelseth later testified, I held him up like that for a while, but I got tired and cold, and I took a little piece of a small board, a lot of which were floating around there, and laid it under his head on the edge of the boat to keep his head from the water, but it was not more than about a half or so hour when he died. When they were picked up by the Carpathia at around 7 a.m., Abelseth was handed a warm blanket and given some coffee and brandy, but he had to sleep on the deck in his wet clothes. He was still a third-class citizen. He later testified, saying he and others in third-class passengers were told not to move from the steerage and that a ship was coming to rescue everyone. Some were not happy about this, with Abelseth stating, there were a lot of steerage people there that were getting on one of those cranes that they had on deck, that they used to lift things with. They can lift about 2.5 tons, I believe. These steerage passengers were crawling along this over the railing and way up to the boat deck, and a lot of them were doing that. Senator William Alden Smith then asked, they cannot get up there any other way? Abelseth replied, the gate was shut. Nonetheless, he did add that he didn't feel the passengers down there were purposefully held back. That part of the ship filled with water so fast that they really had to get out of there fast. When he was asked if it filled quickly, he replied, oh yes, there was a friend of mine who told me that he went back for something he wanted and there was so much water that he couldn't get to his room. This testimony is important in regard to third-class passengers being locked behind gates. Although he seems to contradict himself at times, but forgetting about that, we think this bit of his testimony relating to being on the boat deck is very, very touching. We did not talk very much. Just a little ways from us, I saw there was an old couple standing there on the deck, and I heard this man say to the lady, go into the lifeboat and get saved. He put his hand on his shoulder, and I think he said, please get into the lifeboat and get saved. She replied, no, let me stay with you. I could not say who it was, but I saw that he was an old man. I did not pay much attention to him because I did not know him. Very few people were alive on the ship as long as Abelseth was, but one man certainly outdid him. He was the guy we talked about at the beginning of the show. His name was Charles John Joffin. The Liverpoolian was the chief baker on the ship. When he wasn't baking bread in Liverpool, he was going to the pub with his friends to make use of his monthly wage of £12. As you know, that would have gotten him a seat in the third class on the Titanic. But he was working, not traveling on that fateful day. At about 12:30, he was told he could get into Lifeboat 10 as its captain, but he turned down that and instead helped the women and children. He might have only been 5 foot 3.5 inches, but he was a strong guy for sure. Some women refused to go, either scared or not wanting to leave their husbands behind. But Joffin didn't give them much choice. He virtually threw them into the boats. At one point, he went back to the pantry and had some liquor. We don't know how much, but he was merry as the Titanic went down. As things started crashing and bending all around him, he took it all in stride. He later testified and said, indeed, while all the commotion was going on, he sneaked off for a tipple of liquor. He said at one point, that was just after I'd passed the first lot of bread up and I went down to my room for a drink. As a matter of fact, and as I was coming back, I followed up my men onto the deck. Later in his testimony, he said, I went down to my room and had a drop of liquor that I had down there, and then while I was there, I saw the old doctor, possibly Dr. O'Loughlin, and spoke to him, and then I came upstairs again. So he was pretty smashed when the boat finally went down. He admitted that himself. He was on the Titanic as it became almost vertical and people were spilling everywhere, screaming, bones breaking, old and young, flying like ants shaken from a plate. He said he looked on in horror when the bodies had piled up in one spot. He said he just held on when the Titanic broke in half and went down as if an elevator. When he was asked how frightening it was, he replied, there was no great shock or anything. What a guy. But if you've been to Liverpool, you know it's a tough old town. He was having another drink in the pantry when things started getting crazy. Talking about the grim end when the ship was done, he said, I was just wondering what next to do when she went. He was then in the water for 2 hours. He said about that, I did not attempt to get anything to hold on to until I reached a collapsible, but that was daylight. He was asked, then you were in the water for a long time? He said, I should say over 2 hours, sir. Now this shouldn't have been possible. Others died in mere minutes. Some got through, say, 20 or 30 minutes, but 2 hours treading water at that temperature? How did he do it? When asked if he felt calm, he replied, it's just like a pond. By not getting shocked by the situation, he helped himself a lot. He even stayed calm when a collapsible saw him but refused to let him on. He testified, I tried to get on it, but I was pushed off it, and I what you call hung around it. He also said he was colder in the boat than in the water. When a lifeboat came into sight, he was one of the guys that jumped back into the water and swam toward it, so there was more space in the collapsible. In his testimony, it almost sounds like the commissioner can't believe his ears. At one point, the commissioner says, you've said you thought it was about 2 hours before you saw this collapsible, and then you spent some time with the collapsible. How long do you suppose it was after you got into the collapsible that you were taken into the lifeboat? Joffin replied, I should say we were on the collapsible about half an hour. The commissioner asked, that means that for some 2.5 hours you were in the water. Joffin said, practically yes. We don't actually know how he survived that long in the water, although some say it was the booze. Actually, alcohol doesn't really help you when you're fighting hypothermia, so we reckon the fact that he stayed so calm was more to the point. He actually lived until he was 78, taking in final breaths in New Jersey. His story was talked about for years, so on his death certificate where it asked occupation, it was written Baker on the Titanic. That's all for now, but if you like this show, there are many more testimonies we can recount for you later. Now you need to hear some more technical details in the sinking of the Titanic hour by hour, or have a look at why is the Titanic still at the bottom of the ocean.